time inhabiting the K Spiritual Life Center, the Interfaith Center, which is on the north side of campus. I like to say that we are opposite the library on the quad. I like to think that we are the wings that hold this university, the intellectual and the spiritual are the wings that hold this university aloft. Not everybody would agree with me, but that's all right. Well, we're very privileged, delighted that you're here. This is a very special program, and I've just come from a discussion with all the units of the university in response to an arrest that took place in the terrace dining room of a person who, from outside the campus, who was protesting the treatment of the Aramark food service workers. So it was an example of kind of nonviolent civil disobedience, if you will, and handcuffs were placed on his hands, and he was escorted to a paddy wagon in the terrace dining room. And I'm sure that you can find it on social media if you so desire. But I've just come from that meeting, and I announced that meeting that, lo and behold, we're celebrating the historian, I think, the award-winning, internationally acclaimed historian of the civil rights movement. And much of the civil rights movement had to do with nonviolent civil resistance. And no one can just talk about that better than our speaker. And this particular effort or example of her work, we're talking about the Mahatma Gandhi and the Untouchables, and she brings a very interesting perspective about errors in judgment, if you will, by Mahatma Gandhi. So I'm looking forward to her presentation. To make that presentation and to introduce Mary is Lynn Kunkel, who is associated with the El Kibri Foundation. She may say a word about that. She and Mary have been friends a long time. Last year, in the bitter snows of Minnesota, at a Nobel Peace Prize seminar, they were discussing the months that Mary King spent in the Kerala state of southern India, in the dusty archives and looking at old newspapers, doing research for this monumental work. And so, being friends with Mary for a long time, she has agreed to introduce our guest speaker. So welcome to Lynn and to Mary.
Thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate it. It's really great to be back at AU. And I actually thought I was asked to introduce Mary because I was once a part of a team that was tasked with trying to condense her extensive international accomplishments and try to capture the esteem of the community for her in a very short period of time, because we were awarding the El Hebrew Peace Education Prize to her in 2009. And it was a task to try to capture everything and really show what she has meant to the field and for all of the scholars of nonviolence who have really benefited from her pioneering and her visionary work. And so having been on the task force, trying to do it once, and all the accomplishments she's really, everything she's been up to since then, I think will only make it harder, but I will try to do justice just briefly. For me and for anybody else who is a student of nonviolence, Mary King is well known and is a pioneer the world over for her comparative study of nonviolence movements. When we were awarding her the prize in 2009, she had already published Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King in 2002, which was a must-read for anybody interested in the field and to understand the power and importance of nonviolence movement. Prior to that, she had already won the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Book Award for Freedom Song, a personal journey, a personal story of the 1960s civil rights movement, which chronicled her experiences and her work with Reverend Martin Luther King, and her work alongside other civil rights leaders and as a participant in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And she had already been recognized internationally with a Jamnalal Bajaj International Prize. Thank you. Who was the son and financial backer of Mahatma Gandhi, and it's awarded for people who represent and embody Ghandian values. It's a very prestigious prize. It's been awarded to the likes of Archbishop Desmond Tutu and preeminent scholars such as Johan Galtung. She had already published the same year that we had awarded this prize, the New York Times on emerging democracies in Eastern Europe, which is this enormous comparative study of the nonviolent transitions that had been taking place in the 1980s and 1990s in Eastern Europe. Another amazing research, meticulously researched feat, and had received acclaimed scholarship awards for her book on looking at the 1987 uprising of the Intifada, A Quiet Revolution, the First Palestinian Intifada and Nonviolent Resistance. Just a tremendous book that really chronicles these overlooked aspects of the struggle, and is just a must-read for anybody interested in this work. So, when we had awarded this, it was not just for her peace education scholarship and her nonviolence, but also for her own activism and the work that she had done. And President Jimmy Carter had sent us a note congratulating her over the years for all of her work that she's done. His note in particular called her a true woman of peace, citing her enormous contributions to peace education, and particularly her devotion to peace in the Middle East, and being personally touched by her friendship and generous spirit, and calling her a great asset to the global community and most deserving of these honors that she'd been given. She was an appointee of the Carter administration with worldwide oversight for the Peace Corps and other U.S. Volunteer Service Corps programs. So this is a woman who's both a practitioner of peace, a scholar of peace, who's just done tremendous contributions for the study of nonviolence movements. And of course, since this time, has done even more, has achieved more awards. The James M. Lawson Nonviolent Achievement Award, which is a very prestigious prize as well, and has moved on from then to what must have been a tremendous labor of love, with the assistance of a grant from the USIP. Worked on, and here I'd like to, which is her focus of the talk today, looking at original archival research of a very famous nonviolent struggle against the Untouchabilities in Vaikom and Kerala in India, 1924 to 1925, which is a significantly important work, touching on the building of theory of the mechanisms of change in nonviolent civil resistance. So I was just fascinated talking with Mary about the work that she did and the insights that she developed, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about it. I know it's going to be a very important contribution as well. It was just recently very well received by the Journal of Peace Research for her meticulous research and calling it a very thoughtful book relevant to anybody interested in the theory and practice of nonviolent resistance. I've talked too much, and I'm so pleased, and I can't wait to learn more, and so thank you.
Thank you.
And the book is available for purchase, and I'm just quoting.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with a quotation from Gandhi. I'm going to clip because we've lost a little bit of time in the move, so we want to get cut to the chase here. In 1941, just a few years before he would be assassinated, when Gandhi was musing about complete independence, he said that it must include the end of untouchability. And he asks every Hindu to make common cause with the Harijans. That's Gandhi's coined term, meaning children of God, that he coined for the so-called untouchables. And he asks that they befriend them in their awful isolation, such isolation as perhaps the world has never seen. So in Gandhi's eyes, this was perhaps the most severe and extreme form of discrimination and isolation in the world. I have to say why I chose to go and spend hundreds of hours sweating in archives in South India with no air conditioning. And it was because of a challenge from the scholar Jean Sharp, with whom I've worked over the years. And Mubarak, you will remember that you are the person who introduced me to Jean Sharp now, I suppose, 20 years ago. So Jean said to me, you know, Mary, I believe everything we think we know about this struggle is wrong. And somebody needs to take responsibility to go and correct the record. When Jean says something like that to me, it starts my my curiosity, my desire for an inquisition of what's actually been going on, my desire to interrogate, to dig for the archaeology of it. So, to make a long story short, my institute at Oxford gave me a travel grant to go to Kerala. I got into the archives, which were very difficult for a foreign scholar to get into, enough to see that Jean had been right. So now my curiosity was really intrigued. This is 15 years ago when I'm talking about this conversation with Jean. And these are some of the groups and people who made this study possible. I may have been doing the sweating, but it was other people who were helping as well. My institute in Oxford, the United States Institute of Peace, then recognized the value of having this study and gave a very significant grant to allow me to spend a lot of time in South India. Dino, Anna, Matthew, and Professor Vasu Tillery, I'll show you their photographs in a minute. The Institute of Social Sciences in New Delhi, which became like a home away from home for me. And Christopher Miller, whom some of you know, who worked with Jean Sharp as a special assistant for 4 years and is now a foreign service officer and did some of his studies at AU. So this is an actual photograph of some of the archives that I worked in. This is a newspaper in Calicut. And here I am working with a local historian because everything had to be translated from the language of Kerala, which is Malayalam. And I also had the assistance of Dinu Anna Matthew, who's sitting right down in the front there. She is another native Kerolan. She's working on her doctorate at the University for Peace. And this photograph was taken just recently when my husband Peter Bourne, who's over here, between Mubarak and Nancy, we were just in India doing a lecture tour where this is really hot news. Big public lectures, hundreds of people, and you can see banks of television cameras in the background. Somebody who goes outspokenly on the record, daring to say what Gandhi did right, but also what he did wrong, is big news in India. So this is the only picture I have of Dinu, but also I'm happy to have a chance to tell you that there is avid interest in India. And I was not attacked by anyone once except for someone that my husband thinks was psychotic. So this is a map of the princely state of Travancore, which is where our story takes place. And it was 90 years ago. There was a 20-month struggle because on the roads around the Brahmin temple, the highest caste in the Hindu caste system, called Brahmins, generally throughout India, but in this princely state they were called Nambudris, so you'll hear me use both terms, something you might want to note. The roads around the Brahmin temple could be walked upon by anyone, dog, pig, Christian, Jew, Muslim, anyone except people who had no caste in the Hindu caste system. And that is what the term untouchable refers to. It refers to people who are not low caste, but people who have no caste. They have actually fallen through the bottom of the caste system. Some scholars believe that the term untouchable is an English term that is actually a foreign import, that it's not used in the various languages and patois of India. The public roads around the temple were maintained by the government of the Maharaja of Travancore princely state. So it was public money used to maintain the roads and post the signs that forbade the outcasts to walk on the roads. And that's how the struggle comes into being. Gandhi once called Travancore a golden garden. This is what the state of Kerala looks like. It's lush, it's verdant. Anyone can live anywhere. We know that Jews were arriving to this part of India in the early centuries. But the earliest written document that we have for Jews in Kerala is at the end of the 10th century. The earliest Christians probably came in the centuries after Christ, and the earliest document that we have for the Christians is in the 9th century. The Muslims came after that. Kerala became a state in 1956, and it combined two princely states and a third piece, Malabar district, which was under British India. Kerala is mostly on that map, it's very really southern tip of India. So to emphasize my point that you can live almost anywhere, you can see from these photographs how verdant the area is. Now the Nambudri Brahmins are actually the largest landlords in the state of Kerala, which is something very important for you to know. They're only 2% of the population in the 1920s. The next caste down, the Nayars, are the people who manage the land holdings of the Nambudris, and they're about 20% of the population. And Travancore had a population then of about 2.3 million, and there were about 74% Hindus, 20% Christian, 6% Muslim, and the number of Jews was smaller than that. There were at the time 420 subdivisions of Hindu castes. That's counting the 4 main castes. That's not counting those who fall below the caste system. I'll just go right back here. Some other terms, outcasts, Harijans, Dalits. Dalit is a term coined by Dr. Ambedkar, who was a great advocate for the Untouchables. From his language, it means broken men. You may want to know that. In this part of India, there was something unique, and that is untouchables, but also unapproachables and unseeables. And I'll say a little bit more about that. Untouchability was found everywhere in India, but this was the only place where people who were considered unapproachable had to call out that they were approaching in order to warn the upper castes that they were about to be polluted by the approach of the person who would sully them, who would dirty them, who would make them unclean based on theoretical ranking of purity or lack of purity. The unseeables were the lowest. They were people who could not be seen by an upper caste person. This is only 90 years ago. The unseeables couldn't be seen, and so they could only come out at night. They lived in ditches and hovels and tree trunks. Nowhere else in India did this exist. I mentioned a Maharaja. Actually, in Kerala, the transmittal of sovereignty and property was at the time through women, and the highest power in the Travancore princely state was the Maharani. Maha meaning great, Rani equivalent to queen. And in 1817, one of the Maharanis created a proclamation making education universal for everyone. This explains why we have the particular paradox of extreme, severe discrimination and prejudice, alongside the fact that Travancore was the most educated part of India 90 years ago, and that Kerala is today the state with the highest health status, best educational indicators, highest literacy, finest gender equity, highest participation of political parties. Kerala excels at all of these areas, but we do have a paradox with these extreme forms of prejudice. But it helps for you to know that there were enlightened Ranis and Rajas who had been taking steps, although they refused to allow the roads to be open in the 1920s. In 1855, another ruler ended slavery. So over the years, one particular group among the Untouchables, called Arabas, had become middle class. They began as toddy tappers, as you can see in this photograph, scaling palm trees and tapping the trees and then fermenting the drink. It's an alcoholic drink. But at this point, by the 1920s, only 3% of the Yaravas were actually tapping toddy. Most of them had become like T.K. Madhavan, well-educated, middle class, owning businesses. And they were also paying the highest degree rate of taxes in the state. They paid more taxes than any other group. And from within that group came the quest for a struggle to open the roads around the Brahman temple. And this is a sketch that I commissioned of a statue that stands today because T.K. Madhavan was the originator of the struggle. Gandhi is not the originator, and the Congress Party is not the originator. It's this person who carried in his cane a picture of Gandhi. He became enthralled with Gandhi and began to feel that the polite petitions that his group had been using since the 19th century, there was one petition that had something like 13,000 signatures of Airavas. He began to feel the petitions were not enough. He wanted Gandhi to come. He thought that he was capable of coming up with many, many ideas. And he's the one who actually got Gandhi to agree to the struggle. Gandhi was at the time very, very conservative. I need to mention a couple of other things by way of background. In Nagpur in 1920, there was an initiative, a resolution passed by the Congress Party urging access for untouchables into temples. For those of you who know who James Lawson is, Nagpur is in the center of India, and that's where Jim Lawson spent 3 years teaching before he returned to the United States and became the chief tutor to Martin Luther King and those of us in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So Nagpur is important to me. In the same session, the party adopted Gandhi's program of nonviolent non-cooperation. This is a term that Gandhi coined, non-cooperation, based on the work that he had done in South Africa, where the Indians were suffering very severely from passage of laws that were extremely discriminating. And Gandhi, by 1905, had realized that no system can stand if the people refuse to obey it. It's one of the most penetrating discernments in international political theory since international political theory began. And Gandhi, by 1905, had figured that out. So the Congress Party has now adopted eradication of untouchability and a national program of non-cooperation. So that's on the national level. There also were other resolutions that passed. At Bardoli, the Congress adopted the constructive program, which some of you know about because I know who you've studied with. This is where you have alternative or parallel institutions, people removing themselves from the governing power and creating their own systems outside the established governance. These are the peace communities of Colombia, Joe. You know, the communities that refused to cooperate with the FARC would give them erroneous information, to send them on the wrong roads, that sort of thing. They pulled themselves out, refused to cooperate with the FARC, and would try to thwart them. That comes from Gandhi's constructive program, which he thought was more important than resistance, incidentally. So also by 1924, the Congress establishes an anti-untouchability committee, and that's where the action begins to come from. So it was decided, and Gandhi agreed, that a struggle would begin on March 30th, 1924. And 3 volunteers approached the police barriers that had been elected by the local police under a British police commissioner. Costumes revealed one's rank. The fully clothed volunteer in the back is a high caste Nair. He was fully dressed. But those who were untouchables of whatever rank, sometimes called slave castes and sometimes called serf castes, were half naked. Women were not able to cover their upper bodies until the 19th century in front of a high caste person. So the costumes were meant to announce the severely low status of those who were called untouchables. You can begin to imagine how this was searing generation after generation into the hearts and minds of those who fit that category. Gandhi is advising from afar. He will not visit till the following year. He's very worried, very cautious, afraid of weakening the Maharajas, the princely governments, because he senses that they're being sucked into the imperial system. So he is often putting the brakes on the action. These marchers were arrested, and the next 3 to turn up the next day would also be arrested. Very shortly, there were 19 of the key leaders in jail. Some of them were high caste, and they sent to the next door state for a man named Ramasamy Naikar, who was a fiery orator. They still talk about him in Kerala. They remember him. It's been transmitted in families what a fiery orator he was. And Gandhi was operating on the presumption that it would be possible to convert the high castes through the appeals and the suffering of the volunteers. This book disputes that in entirety. I find no substantiation for that whatsoever, but I'm getting ahead of my story. In April 1924, there was a great flood, and the volunteers tried to maintain the vigils that they had on 3-hour shifts, but it was very difficult. By afternoon, the water would rise to shoulder height. Police boats would strike the volunteers. One volunteer died. However, something else came into effect during this time. The high castes were forced to interact with the outcasts simply to get around. Just managing the conditions of flooding meant that there was more contact than normal. So it helped to feed modernity movements. I'm using the word modern and making it into a name for social movements that were growing in this part of India, modernity movements. All India is by now watching what's happening. People are walking from all over India to come as volunteers. This is news all across India. Gandhi has only returned from South Africa nine years earlier. So this flooding is recorded in the newspapers in which I worked as the worst in human memory. Gandhi sent word that perhaps it would be a good idea if there were 2 grand processions to walk from the village of Vaikom to the capital of Travancore princely state and present the Maharani with petitions. And so the work began to create books or memorials of 25,000 petitions of high caste Brahmins only. And this is a depiction based on newspaper accounts of what the grand procession looked like walking from Vaikom south to Travancore. Yellow was the predominant color because yellow was the color of the movements of the Untouchables themselves. There were social reform leaders who were helping the Untouchables themselves to organize, and their color was yellow. So the high castes adopted their color yellow in order to wear it in this grand procession. After years and years in study of dozens and dozens of movements, and books are too many for me to count, I had never read or heard about this until I got into the archives in Kerala.
Yeah.
This event was just lost to oblivion. And it's a stunner. Their numbers started very small. Approximately 100 set out from Vaikom and 500 from the south, but their numbers would swell to thousands. I had this map done showing the walk of the 2 processions. They arrived in the capital on November 11th. They walked 124 miles from Vaikom to the capital in military procession, meaning 4 across, pacing themselves, and all along the way reaching out to Untouchables. So they're breaking the interdining prohibitions as they go. When they are handed snacks by someone who comes from one of the outcast groups, the high castes accept it. So they are flagrantly breaking the caste system customs. 12-member delegation has an audience with the Maharani, presents the signatures. She is by then ruling over 4 million people. And the signatures ask that she immediately throw open the temple roads all over Travancore princely state. Well, it doesn't happen quite that fast, but she does let out the 19 or 20 leaders who were imprisoned in jail. It's impossible for me to make an exact count because there are differentiations in archival records. Those of you who've done deep archival research know that you find tricky little variants that cannot be resolved. Gandhi decided to come and visit in March 1925. And in the walks that I made around Vaikom with another scholar to help translate with Malayalam, I learned that Gandhi was kept standing at the door for an unseemly period, probably hours, in his meeting with the temple authorities. He was trying to persuade the temple authorities to open the roads. He failed totally. He offered them 3 options, one of which was, all right, bring your own experts, pandits, and let them make the interpretation from the Hindu scriptures. The word pandit is the origin of our English word pundit. So the pundits in the Washington Post, this is a word derived from the pandits, who are the scriptural authorities in Sanskrit. So Gandhi is very much criticized in India, in South India, in Kerala, because he almost prostrated himself before the temple officials. So eager was he to get them to change. They would not budge. So today we can visit the temple still. These are photographs of the temple scene. Sorry, you don't have what I have. Sorry. Some apology. Gandhi's biggest mistakes. I mentioned that Gandhi had made one mistake after another. One of his most profound mistakes, and the one that my students absolutely cannot understand, is that Gandhi paid no attention to the organizing being done by the Untouchables themselves. They are absolutely speechless. They cannot understand it, given the realities of today. The explanation for this is that Gandhi believed that it was the high castes who needed to atone for millennia of barbarity and cruelties against the Untouchables. And so he wanted the high castes to be the ones who led the change. Well, some of them did, but in small numbers, and not enough to persuade their brethren. So this is one very significant criticism of him, because as I mentioned earlier, there were social movements forming. They were democratizing movements. They were opening up the way. When I mentioned that Kerala has more political parties than any other state in India, part of that is because of the mobilizing of the, Jake, I think I need your help here. My screen has gone blank. And your screen has gone blank.
Do you want to try touching the trackpad?
Try tracking back.
Yeah.
This is Jake Fitzpatrick, who is the graduate of AU and has for the last several years worked for the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict. And those of you who have ever watched a webinar of ICNC, it's thanks to Jake that you were able to do that. So let me say some more about Gandhi's mistakes. Yes. I want to tell you that this is where Dr. Lynn Kunkel really got excited in the snows. Gandhi's mistakes. This sounds like a lecture to me. So one of the other things is Gandhi said that no one should participate in the struggle except Hindus. Now, this is still painful and vexing to the Syrian Christian families of Kerala, who were 20% at the time and are approximately that percentage today. And in fact, one leader in particular, George Joseph, a Syrian Christian, had been sent out of the movement by Gandhi. And this is, if you want to see an ebullient expression of people who are perturbed about something that happened 90 years ago, talk with a Syrian Christian family about the fact that Gandhi asked the Syrian Christians to leave the struggle, to leave it to the Hindus. Gandhi's interest was based on his belief that the high castes needed to be the ones to make the change. But it also caused ramifications that are still, unfortunately, perceptible today. He also said no outside money. This was also hard to explain because there were by now contributions flowing in from all over India. Reading in the archives, there are telegrams coming from all over India. A group of Sikh reformers walked from the Punjab to open a canteen at Vaikom for the struggle. He sends them back to the Punjab. So many people did not understand what he was doing or why he was doing it and narrowing down the struggle to such a degree. His biggest mistake is the so-called settlement. What happens is at the end of his visit in March 1925, Gandhi and the British police commissioner sit down and cook up a compromise. It's something that nobody in this room would call a solution. Nobody could pass a course at AU studying peace and conflict studies if you put Gandhi's solution with the British police commissioner on the table and graded it according to today's standards. What actually happened is that the temple authorities were allowed to create an extra diversion road for only temple authorities to use. So the temple officials could still walk into the temple without encountering any outcasts, any untouchables. I think that the best we can say about this is that it might have been management of conflict. I see it as more of almost sleight of hand or legerdemain. It certainly was an error, and it's something that I think we are right to criticize Gandhi for. The Dalits, or the Untouchables, were back where they had started 604 days earlier. So, as a result of this settlement, the Ramasamy Naikar, the man I showed you with the beard, who also has a statue today at Vaikom, he decided to leave the struggle. He was so angry with Gandhi. Others became angry with Gandhi and also left the struggle. What do you think's happening, Jake?
For some reason it reset. I have no idea why. But it's finishing some updates.
Do you think something will come back on?
It should come back on in a few
Okay.
minutes.
All right. So, but we can't write Gandhi completely out of the picture. Because in fact there were other struggles called by the name that Gandhi had coined, Satyagraha, which some of you know as a combination of Sanskrit Satya for truth and Agraha, Gujarati for relentless insistence. And Gandhi coined this term while working in South Africa, meaning nonviolent resistance. That's the closest we can say it in English, but in that combination of languages, it meant relentless pursuit of the truth. And other villages decided to have similar struggles to the one in Vaikom. They got nowhere. The one in Vaikom would eventually bring success if you view it in a long-term, stretched out, roundabout way. In 1936, the Maharaja of Travancore Princely State issued a royal proclamation, not only throwing open all of the temple roads throughout Travancore, but also opening the temples as well. This is an interesting subtle point because the Untouchables in Vaikom were not asking to enter the temples. They were only asking to be allowed to walk on the roads around them because it shortened their walk home from work. So by 1936, 12 years later, as a consequence of everything that was happening in Vaikom, the Maharaja would be moved to take that action and throw it open. These other struggles did not accomplish anything like that. They had no Gandhi, which means that we have to be balanced in our final assessment. Now, going on without the sketches, I want to make an observation, which is because, of course, I've read enormously in Gandhi's 100 volumes. Gandhi is probing the power of social power constantly in his writings, but he does not speak as much about it as he does moral suasion. So when he talks with people, as he's always persuading people, he is talking in moral terms. But if you parse his writings carefully, you see that he's actually pondering the use of social power, which is another term for nonviolent resistance. And that becomes very clear with this struggle. By 1925, after he makes that visit to Vicom, he starts using different words. He starts talking about compulsion and pressure. He is no longer talking about conversion and suffering. So Gandhi is being affected by his own failures and by the struggle in Vicom. He put civil resistance on the world stage. And as I mentioned, he was responsible for one of the most searing insights in politics. I believe that he possibly spoke and wrote more on untouchability than any other subject. So, in the concluding about the book, I need to say a word or two about my judgment that I draw. One is that I would say that metaphysical explanations for nonviolent action do more harm than good. What happened is that within a decade, Westerners came to write about the Vicom struggle and published accounts in the West that have no substantiation. You know some of the names, some of you who've studied with me moderately. Richard Gregg, Joan Bondurant, George Lakey, Gene Sharp. There is absolutely no evidence that anyone's hearts or minds were touched by virtue of the suffering of the volunteers. So their books, which reported that the effort to convert the high castes were successful, and that they decided to throw open their arms and embrace the untouchables. They all use the same sentence, incidentally, with no attribution, no source, no name, no date, no nothing. All of those scholars use the same sentence. We can no longer resist the prayers made to us by the volunteers, and we throw open our arms and embrace the untouchables. There's no substantiation for this whatsoever. This is the report that went traveling through the West. I have taught from Richard Gregg, Joan Bondurant, George Lakey, Gene Sharp. They're all wrong in this account. And I'm not far off from wrong in my book, Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. I don't use those same words, but I talked about Vicom based upon secondary sources. So I think it's really a profound mistake to exaggerate the powers of nonviolent resistance. And it's an even bigger mistake to use metaphysical terms in trying to explain what is a matter of political power. People may have whatever faith they bring into the mobilization, and it's important that we have numbers involved in nonviolent campaigns. But that is not the same thing as the waging of that struggle. Gandhi also had a basic flaw in saying that if there were enough discipline, the stoniest hearts would be melted by nonviolent action. This is actually, I believe, a hazardous article of faith. Many things can account for what happens in a nonviolent movement. And it's simply dangerous, I believe, to say that if there is a failure, it's because the volunteers were insufficiently disciplined. I don't think there's any basis for saying that, and I think it's dangerous, because people might continue seeking conversion through their own suffering and accepting deplorable repression if they believe that it is solely their discipline that is the measure of the outcome of that movement. So I think this study forces us to think more deeply about how we talk about the realities of nonviolent action, because we know the world maps have been changed as a result of national nonviolent movements, but we still have to become more scrupulous in the way that we talk about it. And this is the first verifiable chronology that the world has ever had of what actually happened in this struggle. Now, George Lakey did one very important thing, and that is that he developed a tool for analysis called the mechanisms of change, in which he identified 4 different mechanisms of change, the first of which is conversion. I would propose that we redefine that as an ideal, rather than a literal outcome, which is the way that Gandhi originally talked about it. Nothing wrong with the ideal of persuading hearts and minds to change, but let's call it an ideal. The second mechanism of change, of George Laken's, is accommodation. This is what happens most often. This is what you see in the civil rights movement in the United States, where cities quietly take down the signs saying white and colored. There are no press conferences. We did this as a deliberate strategy. It was a deliberate strategy in Montgomery, it was deliberate in Nashville, not to make any announcements. Just let the change come. Don't ram it down the throat of the opponents. Martin Luther King said, we must live with our opponents the next day as brothers and sisters. That's accommodation. Cut your costs. It's too costly, this movement. Let's just get out of here. Let's concede to their demands. It doesn't mean that hearts and minds have changed, but let's see different behavior. Let's see different policies. Let's go ahead. These demands are fair. Let's change. It would be good for all of us. Nonviolent coercion is the next, and that's where the antagonist or the opponent remains in power but can't get anything done without the cooperation of the nonviolent protagonist. A few years ago, there was a president in West Africa who wanted to become president for life, and there was a 1 million-person march organized by the labor unions. He called on the armed forces to shoot into the 1 million-person march, and the armed forces refused to do that. That's nonviolent coercion. They're still in power, but they can't get anything done unless the nonviolent challengers agree to go ahead with it. And then the final mechanism that George had defined was disintegration, nonviolent disintegration. This is what we would have seen in Serbia as Milosevic is finally collapsed. The dictator is collapsed as a result of the 18 political parties unifying. Not only is the government not obeying his orders, but he can get nothing done. The government can get nothing done. So one thing that I have a beautiful picture of a steamer, if you can just use your imagination for a voyaging steamer ship in the 1920s. This is how African American leaders began traveling to India in 1919. And for 4 decades, black leaders in the middle part of the 20th century in the United States were traveling by ship to India, visiting the sites of struggle in India, often visiting with Gandhi. In 1936, Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College, met with Gandhi. And the first mention that Martin Luther King ever hears of Gandhi is from Dr. Mays in a chapel at Morehouse College when he's about 14 years old. He entered Morehouse early. There were beginning to be recruitment and enlistment of black soldiers. And so those who were not going to World War II could enter Morehouse early. So Martin Luther King entered Morehouse College at a very early age, and he hears about Gandhi from someone who had met with Gandhi, the president of his college. But there were lots of others. Howard University had many, many figures traveling from Washington, the chaplain, the president, many others. So over 4 decades, there's direct transmission of knowledge into communities in the United States, black communities. There are also Indians traveling to the United States to speak. Some of you know that Rosa Parks had gone to Highlander Folk School the year before she refused to give up her seat in Montgomery. And there was an Indian who had traveled to Highlander very close to the time that she was there and had described how he was fighting. So we have a tremendous amount of literal transmission of knowledge going on. And I want to mention, before we go to questions, that Gandhi is the one who's coined the language with which English speakers all over the world talk about this form of struggle. Terms like nonviolent struggle, nonviolent transformation of conflict, nonviolent conflict, non-cooperation, all of these terms are his coinage. The only one about which there's any ambiguity is civil disobedience. I cannot find civil disobedience in Henry David Thoreau. I think it was added later by his editors when it was published. I believe that that may have possibly been coined by Gandhi also. And finally, I want to say that in conclusion, looking at Gandhi's life as an entire sweep, a long life, and what he has given to the world, I do, despite his errors and blunders in this particular struggle, consider him the greatest figure of the 20th century, certainly in terms of impact. Everywhere you look today, Guatemala, Malaysia, the umbrella movement in Hong Kong, the national nonviolent revolutions that swept the Eastern Bloc and began the collapse of the Soviet Union, enormous codification that he has given to the world and his basic discernments. He's the first non-Western figure of the modern era to capture worldwide attention. And Viacom was an early cauldron for testing techniques that we are still using today. So by the 1940s, he's not, if you might want to look, he's not using the humble appeals that he was talking about earlier. He's using mass refusal to pay rent and taxes. He delegitimizes the British Raj. Economic price is being paid. He raises the cost of the British Raj. I don't think we can say that he got rid of the British. There were many factors involved. But he certainly raises the costs and delegitimizes the British Raj. And he gives us our first comprehensive theory and praxis of nonviolent struggle. So in August 1947, India becomes an independent nation. And what the New York Times said when it wrote its editorial on that event was that India has no copyright on caste. Now, in this lecture tour that I was just giving in India, I was asked at one of the academic seminars that I gave, what does this mean, India has no copyright on caste? I said, well, what it means is that there are lots of places that have severe and extreme discrimination. And I will just conclude by saying that I believe that we are dealing with something that is equivalent to a chronic disease when we are talking about these forms of pernicious human prejudice and discrimination. We can't get rid of them by a single outlawing in the Indian Constitution. That has not ended untouchability. Everybody knows the family origin of another Indian by their name. We know we have not eradicated racism in the United States. We need to be on the case of these chronic forms of pernicious discrimination and prejudice every day and every hour. That's the way we must look at them. We cannot eradicate them with this law or that law. So, for those of you who can stay, I'd be delighted for us to have questions and answers now. Thank you.
PowerPoint turned on just now?
If we can get some pictures back, I might put some pictures up for us to look at while we're having Q&A. Is that possible? Okay, Michael, you have your hand up?
Sure.
Yeah.
You seem to have said almost two contradictory things. Your last remarks were, it's not just a question of passing laws, because that won't work to fully end caste discrimination. And yet, a few moments earlier, you talked about how Gandhi moved away from persuasion and really was talking about political power and mobilizing people in terms of political power and laws to make for changes. So, is there still some validity to the call by Gandhi for a focus on persuasion as the ultimate long-term goal? Or am I hearing you wrong?
I actually don't think that there's any conflict. because the eradication of untouchability, which I began by saying was what he saw as complete independence. He knew that the British could not grant the kind of independence he was looking for. The kind of independence that Gandhi sought, only the Indian people could create that, and they would have to massively overhaul their social structures. He knew that would never come from a foreign power, and he knew that nothing the British said in this area would count or have any impact. So he's dealing with the realities of the situation. And he understands, the fact he calls this possibly the most extreme form of suffering that the world has ever seen shows you how perturbed he is by it. But he understands that it's something that is going to require work. He's no longer thinking that it can happen simply by converting the upper castes. He, in his work with the Communist Party, for example, he does not ask them to change their beliefs. He does not ask them to believe in nonviolence. He never talks that way to them. He only asks one thing, that they go along with the rules of action. And I think that's where we have to position ourselves with nonviolent struggle. People come into movements with their own beliefs. That's not our preoccupation. People believe all sorts of things in movements. If you were asking for people who are pure in their belief of nonviolence, there will be a tiny movement. It may not even be a movement. It may be a micro-campaign. If you require that everyone be a pacifist in a campaign, it will be a very small campaign. I think what we have to understand and appreciate Gandhi is that in his long life, he learns from his errors. He is learning from his errors. He makes still more errors with Dr. Ambedkar. He thinks that Dr. Ambedkar is a high caste advocating for the Dalits. He doesn't understand that he is himself an outcast. So, but Gandhi was never afraid to criticize himself. I don't think we should be afraid to criticize him either. And what I would like you to take away is that by overstating or over-advocating the virtues of nonviolent action, we may do more harm than good. I believe that's what happened here, because we've had a severe delay in the fields of international relations, political science, sociology, even social mobilization theory, coming to confront the reality of what nonviolent action can achieve. It's only since Serbia that we begin to hear from these other disciplines wanting. My life has changed as a consequence of Serbia. I get asked to speak at places I had never been asked to speak before. These are not people who are ever going to believe in nonviolence. They want to know how the power works. They want to know what are the implications, and they are beginning to ask questions comparable to the questions that we ask in peace and conflict studies. Is it possible to build more peaceable societies? You begin to hear the realists beginning to ask hypothetical questions like that now as a consequence of the change that they can see tangibly. But I think we've lost. I think that the field has been hurt by the false reports, the misrepresentations that traveled out about this particular struggle. This particular struggle is the one. Yes, Steve?
Mary, here you debunked a major national figure, international figure. How were you received in India?
Well, you've given me a terrific excuse to go on and show you. All right, so I had public lectures with hundreds of people coming to hear about this, and this is. Can you see the little? Anything come up when I move the cursor now? Okay. This is Vicom today. There is a center dedicated to Gandhi. I am given something called cloth of gold, a wrap of cloth of gold as a gift for speaking there. But I was very tough, Peter. Wasn't I tougher in Vicom than anywhere else? Yeah, because they deserve to know the truth. There's a pond in Vicom where a local resident who's a sort of lay historian told me that hundreds of untouchables had been killed and thrown into that pond in the 19th century. It is today a bus depot. So I was harder in Viacom than anywhere else. If you look at the bottom here, Steve, can you see the bank of television cameras? All these people standing in the background are television cameras as I am speaking. And then the meeting where I'm speaking over there, before I spoke, the president of one of the important colleges in New Delhi said, Professor Mary, if I did not know you, I would consider this book heresy. But she then went on and talked for more than an hour about how good it was that somebody had taken all this apart and had made it available for understanding. There also was a speech by the Speaker of the lower house in the Parliament, who turned to me and said, Madam, you have shamed me. I did not know that these things existed in my own country. And we also had a speaker from the upper house in Parliament, who is one of the parliamentarians from Kerala. And he was very effusive in the rigor of the study and how much he had learned from it. And he is himself a professor of history, in addition to being a parliamentarian. Now, did anybody attack me? Yes. I don't have a picture from that evening right here. But there was a man in a public library in one town who said that I had been unfair to the Arabs, and he pinpointed, he said the first 2 sentences of chapter 2. So I quickly opened the book and I looked at the first 2 sentences of chapter 2. And it's like saying nothing as far as describing the Arabs. I'm describing the group that brings the challenge in Viacom, the Arabs. Peter happens to be a psychiatrist by background, and he said that the man was a psychiatrist. He said he could tell by the way that he spoke. He was extremely erratic, extremely duplicative, not making any sense, and not pinpointing anything. By and large, people were very interested and very respectful, and part of the reason, I think, is that the Indians stopped researching Gandhi after independence. They made him the father of the nation, and sort of, okay, we've done that, we don't have to do anything else. We don't see in the work of Indian scholars, today's Indian scholars, vetting and interrogating struggles either in India today or in the past, and we need them. We need Indian researchers very badly. The world needs them. Thank you for your question. I think, Lynn, did you have a question?
Well, I mean, I would love to say, first as Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies at the UN Affiliated University of Peace in Costa Rica and Distinguished Rothermere American Institute Fellow, University of Oxford, because I was remiss in saying that before. But given your position in the field, I think these insights and these criticisms are profoundly healthy for us to hear, because I think if somebody else had said, look, with enough discipline, you could have converted, I think many people wouldn't have listened to those insights. They would have shut them out as someone who just doesn't get it, doesn't appreciate it, or tries to shut it down. But I think you bringing that insight here really forces us to listen, and it represents a maturing, I think, in the field. And it's a really tremendous and a very important contribution. I was going to ask you, what did eventually then lead to the transformation? Whenever the roads were open and all this, I wanted to hear more about what actually led to that moment happening some 12 years later.
Well, I think that that it was impossible within the 604 days of the immediate struggle for the high caste to let go of all of the benefits, advantages, and privileges that they had had for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Hindu caste system coheres or becomes slowly instituted around 500 years before the Common Era, or as it was said in the past, before Christ. So we're talking about millennia of these practices of condemning some people to being so low that they can't even be seen and can only come out alone. I think that there's a problem of asking for change when there's great social distance. Some have written about this. Thomas Weber has written about this. The change is most easy when there's the least social distance. You can most easily penetrate or pierce the defense mechanisms, the socially closer you are between the challengers and the targeted group. The distance here was profound and very, very deeply ingrained. The Brahmins believed that the land had been given to them by a god. I mentioned that the land holdings were important. Marxist historians began working a few decades ago and pointed out that most of the land was owned by the Nambudri Brahmins, that this had nothing to do with religion. It had to do with the ownership of land. The Nairs, who were 20% of the population, and the next caste down, were the managers of the land. So there's quite a bit of meat here, not all of which one can go into in an hour, but there were many, many factors, and eventually, within the palace, because this is a progressive princely state that has led in the eradication of slavery, the education of the untouchables and outcasts. The Maharani who releases the 19 or 20 leaders also does a great deal of work to help women, women's colleges and so on. So social distance is really a factor, and I think that it took 12 years for that to settle in and for the palace to realize that there could be no justification and that that was not true Hinduism. And that, you find material like that in the archives. This is part of the Maharaja's proclamation. He speaks in that way. But I want to remember something that you said to me when we were talking in the snows of Minnesota. You said, I think, Mary, that sometimes we ask too much of our leaders. And it's a good thing for us to be able to look at them objectively and say where there were weaknesses and where there were strengths. I've never forgotten that comment. Yes, I've seen your hand up in the back. Yes.
Yeah, my curiosity is, what were Gandhi's takeaways? You have a critique of what was mistaken in the way he approached this campaign, and he had 20 plus years afterwards to look back on it and decide what he liked or didn't like about it, what he would change. What were his big takeaways in South?
If anything, he becomes more persuaded of the barbarity of untouchability. By 1932, he embarks on a fast unto death in Pune and brings about an accommodation with Dr. Ambedkar. It is Gandhi who actually appoints Dr. Ambedkar to be head of the group in the Constituent Assembly of the new Indian governance, to be in charge of the writing of the resolution that outlaws untouchability. So if anything, Gandhi becomes more determined to work on the ending of untouchability. He never goes back and does it on a grassroots level. This is his first struggle having returned from South Africa. And he knows that he made mistakes because of when you see that he's using entirely different words a year later, talking about compulsion, compelling change, bringing about public pressure for change. His entire vocabulary has changed from the moral language that he's using a year earlier. He is not ever fearful of admitting that he's made blunders. He talks about them as Himalayan mistakes. Big, very big. He talks about Himalayan blunders. I admire this about him, that he was willing to criticize himself. But he becomes very, very determined. And I'm not, to go back to your question, Michael, I'm not saying that he was never able to use conversion, because on the eve of independence, the Bengali chief minister, Shurawadi, who had been quite hostile to him and reluctant to recognize him, he was Muslim and he was not a student of Gandhi's. But Gandhi begins working with him as there are riots in Calcutta. He and Gandhi move into the mansion of a Muslim widow, and by day they go out into the streets talking with people, asking for subsidence of the riots. And Shurawadi finally says that he had made a horrible mistake and makes a kind of confession. So Gandhi did have an effect on the heart of the Bengali chief minister, and he's written about it, and so has his family. It's just that he's no longer believing that this is the only way that change comes. So he does retain until his dying breath his conviction that India will never have true independence until it eradicates untouchability. Nancy, you had your hand up.
I'm curious if Gene Sharp let you in on what it was that provoked this question in his head that this could be an error. And the second part of it was, did Gene say there's yet another movement he thinks we may have been totally wrong? I'm just curious if there's another book coming here. Gene Sharp thing.
You know, this is a very interesting question, because I believe that Gene intuited it. And this may sound a little bit daffy to you, because a clinical psychologist will say, well, what is intuition? It's a form of knowledge. I believe that his study, Milton,
Thank
thank
you,
you so
Mary.
much for coming.
Thank you for being
Let me
here.
just introduce, this is the famous journalist and historian Milton V. Yorst, who has a book on Zionism coming out in the spring. Zionism, a transformation. Is that the name of it? I think that, you know, with 60 years of Gene studying, I think that in that sense of intuition, as the clinical psychologists teach us, it's a form of knowledge. He had discerned that something was terribly wrong here. And as far as your other question, is there another struggle that he suggests that I take up? I don't think, if he started moving in that direction, I probably would move through the door. I do have another book in the cooker, and Trevor Hugh Davis is a photo editor who's working with me on it. And I'm going back to Mississippi with Trevor in November, and I'm beginning a deeper look. Where's Freedom Song, Joe? Is that in your sack?
Where's my book here?
Okay, it's on the floor. It's on the floor, right there in the corner. I'm going to take a deeper look at the meaning of the civil rights movement in Mississippi, with interviewing of people that I photographed long ago and looking at their families. So it's not Freedom Song Revisited. That's why I wanted you to see this. The new book is not Freedom Song Revisited, which is what I did, what we were doing, how we did it, and so on and so forth. It's the impact on the lives of families of the movement, how they changed, how their values changed, what changed at a very, very deep level. And so we'll be working on that in the next year. Mubarak.
Have you met recently with any groups that are still working with Untouchable? Are there advocates on that? Have you met with them, or?
I haven't sought them out because the lecture tour was so intense. I usually only had about 10 minutes free a day. The press interest was very substantial. I had 2-hour-long television interviews, for example, and lots of print media. So that when there was a free moment, I was just booked for one interview after another. However, I did, along the way, there were people who were active in such groups who were very eager to talk, and they were interested to know that there had been some criticism of this struggle. They don't like the idolizing, they don't like the lionizing glorification of Gandhi. They feel that he made mistakes, as you know. And for someone who is working on the basis of scholarship, they found it welcome that somebody had dug very deeply on this.
But hopefully also that we will start looking at also our leader here, like Martin Luther King, what some of the mistakes he has been making too.
Yes, absolutely.
Mary, I think we should probably take one more question. and
We
then-
have 2 questions now, so I think
And
you have to be the arbiter.
And then we can,
Or shall we hear both questions and see if they
Okay.
can be answered?
and then if folks want to stick around and
Yes,
visit.
please, I'll stay, yes.
Mine builds on the last one. I was going to ask you if there was any.
Introduce yourself.
Sorry, Judy Gearhart,
International Labor Rights Forum. And I have to say, I actually heard about your impact without knowing it was your impact. Because colleagues who are working on forced labor issues in India, I met with them during the UN meetings recently, and they were talking about the, people questioning Gandhi. And so one of my questions for you is, how this impacts the Dalit movement, but also, do you have concerns about ways in which what your core learning is might get misinterpreted or misused? Because with that many people listening and hearing, you'll have different parts of so many fragmented movements pulling what they want from it.
Are you talking about what's in this book? Or
What's in this book and how the message was heard and might be used for people's social movements today in India?
Okay, can we hear the other question,
Yeah.
please?
Actually, I just, my name is Dia Basu, I'm from India. And
Where are you
studying-
from?
I'm from Calcutta, Kolkata now.
Yes.
Actually, I just wanted your comment, since you've been with the civil disobedience and civil rights movement in this country and have studied my country quite a bit in detail, and since you believe so much in the power of pictures. Last year in September 2014, when Prime Minister Modi visited India, the President actually took an unscheduled trip with him down Martin Luther King's memorial in downtown DC. And I just wanted your comment on what that says about a Prime Minister who, has been, he's been acquitted, but there's still a lot of doubt about his role in the riots in Gujarat in 2002 and what that means for human rights. And is it really just when real politics takes over and it's an attempt to whitewash what his role was by, flashing this picture of President Obama and him walking down.
So with regard to the misuse, I think that the more scrupulous the treatment of nonviolent struggle, the better for everyone. Because there has been a tendency on the part of advocates over the years to exaggerate. And I believe that that's what happened in this instance. Why there are a dozen writers, I didn't name all of them, I named those that I thought would mean something. I know Betty has studied in this division and so on. I picked the names that I thought would be recognized. But there are lots of people who carried the same quotation with no attribution about something that never happened. And it gave a completely wrong picture about a major struggle in which if we look at it objectively and honestly in terms of what really happened, the learnings are much more profound. This movement falls apart at the end. So do today's movements. Today's movements do a very, very bad job of planning for what happens if they succeed or if they fail.
Yeah.
We never asked ourselves in Mississippi in 1964 what we would do if our challenge before the National Democratic Convention in Atlantic City failed. We never entertained the possibility of failure, and as a result, we were flattened. We needed to have option B and option C in hand. So there are lots of lessons for today's movements in this, but I think that an honest interrogation is really much better and more prudent, and I'm not too worried about that. I would like the Indian scholars to become more active in going back to their own struggles and doing investigations that are not based on legend and myth, but are based on actual interviewing and deep, deep social science research. I know it's tough. I know how tough it is. I know that not everybody wants to invest that, but we really need it. With regard to your question, which is such an interesting question, the Prime Minister represents a viewpoint that India should militarize now. And so we really do have a sort of vindication of my point that India made Gandhi father of the nation and then just walked away from him. And it's accelerating. With regard to the Martin Luther King, I think that there's a book in the AU library, the book Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, The third chapter is all about James Lawson and the role that he played. He was the main trainer for Martin Luther King and for the student wing, which I worked for. And he's the one who spent 3 years in Nagpur teaching at a college there. So there is a tremendous amount of direct, explicit transmission of knowledge from India to the U.S. civil rights movement, which many people are totally unaware of. And it's not discussed, it's not studied, it's not talked about, and yet it's a fabulous story because it's fundamentally empowering. Martin Luther King had to learn this somewhere. How did he learn it? Well, he learned it by studying Gandhi. And when he heard the chaplain of Howard University speak after he was in seminary in Pennsylvania, one day the chaplain spoke, he went out, he bought 6 books on Gandhi. And then he began studying it. Everything that Martin Luther King says until the letter from Birmingham City Jail, if you parse it carefully, is Gandhian. Sometimes word for word, with direct attribution, with direct quotations and no attribution. However, he was a preacher, and preachers are never concerned with scholarship. They are concerned with change right in the here and now. So I think that we need a reawakening of a new look at Gandhi in India and around the world. And we shouldn't be afraid of that. And that it will help to illuminate things like the giant development juggernaut of India, which is running roughshod over poor people, poor communities, women, children, the alienated, Dalits. Everything is being sacrificed in the name of development. So I'm staying around for a while for those of you who want to talk.